The book that I've written that most tried to frame my concern with popular culture to a more general audience is the collection of essays, Outlaw Culture. And in the beginning of that book, what I say is that students from different, class backgrounds and ethnicities would come to my classes, and I would want them to read all this metalinguistic theory and of difference and otherness, and they would say, well, what does this have to do with our lives? And I found continually that if I took a movie and said, well, did you go see this movie, and how do you think about it? And I related something very concrete in popular culture to the kind of theoretical paradigms that I was trying to share with them through various work. People seemed to grasp it more, and not only that, it would seem to be much more exciting and much more interesting for everybody. Because popular culture has that power in everyday life.
My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Whether we're talking about race or gender or class, popular culture is where the pedagogy is. It's where the learning is. And so I think that partially people like me who started off doing feminist theory or more traditional literary criticism or what have you begin to write about popular culture, largely because of the impact it was having as the primary pedagogical medium for masses of people globally who want to, in some way, understand the politics of difference. I mean, it's been really exciting for someone like me, both in terms of the personal desires I have to remain bonded with the working class culture and experience that I came from, as well as the sort of Southern black aspect of that, and at the same time to be a part of a diasporic world culture of ideas, and to see how can there be a kind of interplay between all of those different forces. Popular culture is one of the sites where there can be an interplay. My own sense is that the most enabling resource that I can offer as a critic or an intellectual professor is the capacity to think critically about our lives. I think thinking critically is at the heart of anybody transforming their life, and I really believe that a person who thinks critically, who may be extraordinarily disadvantaged materially, can find ways to transform their lives that can be deeply and profoundly meaningful, in the same way that someone who may be incredibly privileged materially and in crisis in their life may remain perpetually unable to resolve their life in any meaningful way if they don't think critically. As someone who's moved from teaching at very fancy, private, predominantly white schools to teaching at an urban, predominantly non-white campus in Harlem, and the first thing I noticed was that my students were equally brilliant in the Harlem setting as they were when I taught at Yale or Oberlin, but their senses of what the meaning of that brilliance was and what they could do with it, their sense of agency was profoundly different. When students came to Yale, they came there knowing that they're the best and the brightest, and they think that they have a certain kind of future ahead for them, and they in a sense are open to embracing that future. It has nothing to do with the level of knowledge. It has more to do with their sense of entitlement about having a future. And what I see among my really brilliant students up in Harlem, many of whom have very difficult lives, they work, they have children, is that they don't have that sense of entitlement. They don't have that imagination into a future of agency. And as such, I think many professors do not try to give them the gift of critical thinking in a certain kind of patronizing way. Education just says all these people need is tools for survival, basic survival tools like their degree so they can get a job, and not in fact that we enhance their lives in the same way we've enhanced our lives by engaging in a certain kind of critical process. it's scary to me now because particularly in issues around, you know, erotica and sexual violence, people want to deny the direct link between representations and how we live our lives. I think that it's possible to embrace the knowledge that there's a direct link between representations and choices we make in our lives that does not make that link absolute, that does not say, you know, oh, if I look at a movie in which a woman is fucked to death, you know, then I will go out and think I should let myself be fucked to death by any man who wants to fuck me. I think that that's an absurd sense of a direct link. But that is not to say that if I watched enough of those images, I might not come away thinking that that certain forms of unacceptable male violence and coercion in relationship to my female body are acceptable. It's frightening to me now when people want to behave as though certain images don't mean anything. I thought of this when I saw Larry Clark's Kids, and I went back like in circles of progressive white friends and I said, oh God, you know, the racial politics in terms of representation in this film really sucked.
What's up? What's up? What you mean? What's up? What's up?
And they really wanted to say it didn't matter. It didn't mean anything. And I was like, give me a fucking break. I mean, like, we know why the person who's brutally bashed to death is a dark-skinned black man. It's crucial that he's a dark-skinned black man. Because in fact, people's antipathy to dark-skinned black men is actually much greater than their antipathy to black men in some kind of general way. I feel that it's frightening that as mass media uses more certain kinds of representations for specific impact and effect, we're also being told that these images are not really that important. Think about all the Americans who've never ever in their lives for one, second thought about Scotland and Ireland, who went to see Braveheart, who suddenly put notions of British imperialism and the freedom of Ireland on their little social maps because of a Hollywood movie. I was truly awed by how much a Hollywood film could totally alter people's perceptions of national liberation struggles globally in a way that would call attention to those who are in a sense the underclass in those struggles. And that is also the power of white male privilege. White male stardom. I mean, it's important for people to look at who produced and directed that film. Because it's not just that Hollywood can do that, it's that specific liberal white men who are moneyed within the context of Hollywood can produce whatever images that they want to produce. If we look at the recent movie Smoke, where the thief is a black kid. Now, in the original script, it's based on a story by Paul Auster. In the story, there's no racial identification of the character. So when I talked to Wayne Wang, who directed the film, I said, why did you choose to make the thief black? And he putters and stutters around, but he can't say. He will not say, because the only thing he can say is, this will give this movie more zip to make the thief black. It will make it more compelling to people. It'll give a kind of good guy, bad guy quality to it. And it will just make it all the more stimulating, because he would have to admit that the fact that he simultaneously, in making that choice, is also reproducing certain kinds of racial stereotypes. Nobody wants to lay claim to consciously constructing these images that perpetuate white supremacy, racism, etc.
Give me your words, motherfucker! You disrespected me! You dissed me, motherfucker!
And the ironic thing is that I can sit in classrooms in universities where my students don't want to accept that someone consciously creates that representation.
Where are those transmissions you intercepted? What have you done with those plans?
How come people didn't think about Darth Vader and the whole sort of sense of who decides what voice will constitute the villainous voice?
If this is a consularship, where is the ambassador?
I mean, what does it mean that media has such control of our imaginations that they don't want to accept that there are conscious manipulations taking place, and that in fact we want to reserve, particularly for the arena of movie making, a certain sense of magic, a certain sense that reality is being documented, and again, you know, I think that part of the power of cultural criticism and cultural studies has been its sort of political intervention as a force in American society to say there really is a conscious manipulation of representations, and it's not about magical thinking, it's not about like pure imagination, creativity, it's about people consciously knowing what kinds of images will produce a certain kind of impact.
I will love you my whole life. You and no other.
One of the issues that no one wants to talk about is that finally the most successful political movement in the United States of the last 20 years was really feminist movement, and that there is a tremendous backlash to feminism that is being enacted on the stage of mass media, so that films like Leaving Las Vegas really are about ushering in a new old version of the desirable woman that really is profoundly misogynist-based and sexist. It's no accident. We know that when women went into the factories in the world wars because men were not here, that when those wars ended, mass media was used to get women out of the factory and back into the home. Well, in a sense, mass media is being used in that very same way right now to get women out of feminism and back into some patriarchal mode of thinking. And movies, to me, are the lead propaganda machine in this right now.
So for $500 you can do pretty much whatever you want. You can fuck my ass.
Oh my God.
You can come on my face.
Oh.
I began to use the phrase in my work, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, because I wanted to have some language that would actually remind us continually of the interlocking systems of domination that define our reality, and not to just have one thing be like, you know, gender is the important issue, race is the important issue. But for me, the use of that particular jargonistic phrase was a sort of shortcut way of saying all of these things actually are functioning simultaneously at all times in our lives. And that if I really want to understand what's happening to me right now at this moment in my life as a black female of a certain age group, I won't be able to understand it if I'm only looking through the lens of race. I won't be able to understand it if I'm only looking through the lens of gender. I won't be able to understand it if I'm only looking at how white people see me. I mean, one of the to me, an important breakthrough I felt in my work and that of others was the call to use the term white supremacy over racism, because racism in and of itself did not really allow for a discourse of colonization and decolonization, the recognition of the internalized racism within people of color. And it was always, in a sense, keeping things at the level at which whiteness and white people remained at the center of the discussion. in my classroom, I might say to students, that when we use the term white supremacy, it doesn't just evoke white people. It evokes a political world that we can all frame ourselves in relationship to. And I think that I was able to do that because I grew up, again, in racial apartheid, where there was a color caste system. So that obviously I knew that through my own experiential reality, that it wasn't just what white people do to black people that was wounding and damaging to our lives. I knew that when we went over to my grandmother's house, who looked white, who lived in a white neighborhood, and she called my sister Blackie because she was dark and her hair was nappy, and my sister would sit in a corner and cry or not want to go over there, I knew that there is some system here that is hurting this little girl, that is not directly the direct hit from the white person. And white supremacy was that term that allowed one to acknowledge our collusion with the forces of racism and imperialism. And so for me, those words were very much about the constant reminder, one, of institutional constructs, that we're not talking about personal constructs in the sense of how do you feel about me as a woman or how do you feel about me as a black person, but they really seem to me to evoke a larger apparatus. And I don't know why those terms have become so mocked by people, because in fact, far from simplifying the issues, I think they actually, when you merge them together, really complicate the questions of freedom and justice globally, because it means then that we have to look at what black people are doing to each other in Rwanda. We have to, and we can't just say racism, what have you. We have to problematize nationalism beyond race in all kinds of ways that I think there's a tremendous reluctance, particularly in the United States, to have a more complex accounting of identity. The issue is not freeing ourselves from representations. It's really about being enlightened witnesses when we watch representations, which means that we are able to be critically vigilant about both what is being told to us and how we respond to what is being told. Because I think that the answer is not the kind of censoring absolutism of a right-wing political correctness, but in fact of a proactive sense of agency that requires of all of us, one, a greater level of literacy. I think that we cannot begin to talk about freedom and justice in any culture if we're not talking about mass-based literacy movements, because I think that literacy, as we know from the work of Marshall McLuhan and many others, that the degrees of literacy determine so often how we see what we see, how we interpret it, what it means for our lives, and that there's a way in which radical movements for freedom in the United States devalue the significance of literacy as a radical agenda for politicization. So it seems to me that the two major factors of intervention have to do with both critical thinking and then the capacity to read and write. Because so much enlightening information only comes through the printed page. So if people are not able to read and write, they already don't have access to those forms of enlightenment. I mean, if we look at someone like Malcolm X, he charts his own intellectual development through reading. If you look at me, I chart major radical interventions in my life with books that I've read, not movies that I've seen, not television shows, but books that I've read. We cannot overvalue enough the importance of literacy to a culture that is deeply visual. I mean, that rather than seeing literacy and the visual and our pleasure in the visual as oppositional to one another, I think we have to see them as compatible with one another. I don't think we will get much further in terms of decolonizing our minds so that we can both resist certain kinds of conservatizing representations and at the same time create new and exciting representations. It's always difficult when I want people to see that I can be deeply moved by a film and at the same time see the kind of dilemmas that are involved in the production of certain kinds of representations. And Hoop Dreams was another case where I wanted people to see that this documentary reflected as much about the individuals who shot it and directed it as it did the lives of the people that they were shooting, and that they made certain kinds of choices. They made choices about when to show us that one of the boys had a girlfriend and that she was pregnant. It's like all of a sudden you blink, you think, wait a minute, we didn't even know he had a girlfriend and now he's, you know, going to be a father. What happened? What that moment should have made audiences remember is that you are not getting some direct account of this individual's life or these two individuals, but that in fact you are getting a version of their life mediated by the concerns and interests of the filmmakers. And I think people were hostile to having to, again, to be asked not to think of this as a true story in the sense of the innocent filmmaker who is just turning the camera on the lives of these young black men and we get to see it, but in fact as people who had a very definite message that they wanted to get out of those lives. I mean, what really struck me about Hoop Dreams was that it presented itself initially as a critique of certain aspects of American sports, American idealism, American notion of democratic access to success.
You have to realize that nobody cares about you. You're black. You're a young male, all you're supposed to do is deal drugs and mug women. The only reason why you're here, you can make their team win. If their team wins, these schools get a lot of money.
But in fact, as the film developed, it reinscribed those values as the important values. And in fact, the young man who turns his back on those values, I felt cinematically became the lesser character, the non-heroic character in the film. But we're not made to feel that it's heroic when he chooses to focus on his academic studies and not to play basketball, which is where the film begins, I think, to let down its earlier critique in the interest of having a mass-based appeal. The upbeat ending, the sort of conclusion that suggests it was still possible for one of these black guys to succeed, to make it, was part of what the thrill for many moviegoers, you know, that it wasn't an indictment of the American dream ultimately, that in fact it was a film that was saying, in spite of it all, in spite of the corruption, you can still hold on to this dream and it can give your life meaning. The O.J. Simpson case was not compelling to me personally as something to watch and to observe and to talk about, because I felt the deepest terms in relation to Guy Debord's work on the notion of spectacle. It was situated as spectacle from the very beginning, and it seemed to me that that construction of it as a kind of carnival, as a spectacle, meant that one could actually not participate in that without in fact colluding with the very forces, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, that had led to the violent death of Nicole Simpson in the first place. And I felt morally and ethically that as a feminist who has opposed domestic violence, who has wanted there to be a recognition of the meaning of domestic violence as one of the ways in which patriarchy affirms and perpetuates itself. It was impossible to feel that in any way benefiting from this, that I was actually not then colluding in not only affirming the patriarchal culture of violence that surrounded this case, but also actually working to do the very thing I critique about patriarchy in my work around domestic violence, which is that we're made to think that this is a lesser story, and the more interesting story is the story of the life of the perpetrator. It seems to me again and again that part of what patriarchy does to reaffirm itself, and violence is one of the strategies that it perpetuates and reaffirms itself, is making us all identify with men who are violent as potentially our heroes.
Not guilty of.
From a shelter for battered women in Chicago, a surprising reaction, cheering his innocence.
So it felt to me that the spectacle was already constructed before any of us were invited to be onlookers, observers, witnesses, etc., in such a way that I simply did not believe that any of us as individuals had the power to intervene on it so that our words and our writings would not in fact be used to further the spectacle, and not in fact to further people's concern with domestic violence. And certainly Nicole Simpson was the incredible example of a person who had money and who could have altered her life in significant ways that she did not choose to alter her life. Perfect candidate on a certain level for a more complex understanding of patriarchy and domestic violence and women's allegiance to sexism. One of the sad aspects of Nicole Simpson's life was her own continual allegiance to sexism and patriarchy, even as it was threatening her life.
What does he look like? O.J. Simpson. I think you know his record. Could you just send somebody over here? Okay, what is he doing there? He just drove up again. He just drove up over? Okay, wait a minute. What kind of car is he in? He's in a white Bronco. But first of all, he broke the back door down to get in. Okay, wait a minute. What's your name? Nicole Simpson. Okay, is he the sportscaster or whatever? Yeah. Okay, just stay on the line. I don't want to stay on the line. He's going to beat the shit out of me. Wait a minute. Wait, just stay on the line so we can know what's going on until the police get there, okay?
I don't give a shit anymore. She does so much for this motherfucker.
Could you just please, OJ?
The one time that I did go on television and I said that I could be on Good Morning America and I could be asked about the O.J. Simpson case, and it was stipulated all, beforehand that I could be asked one question. I was asked to just give my response, but they really wanted me to say who was innocent and who was guilty. And what I said was that the only thing I really knew about the O.J. Simpson case was that it began and ended with male violence, and that no one, to my knowledge, ever speculated that there were a bunch of women waiting outside that house to hack anybody to death. Cut the cameras. That's not the quote that anybody wanted to hear. They wanted the black woman to be choosing against the white woman or to be protecting the black man. They wanted this whole racialized scenario. When the issue is male violence against women, let's bring on some other kind of issue that makes us not pay real attention to male violence. And that's why race offered the perfect sort of screen to have another drama that everybody could be linked to. The masterful nature, conservative aspect of this spectacle was it so successfully got people to move back into very one-dimensional positions of identity, politics, of racial or sexual essentialism, because there was no frame within the spectacle itself to allow for a complex accounting of what was taking place. It's only in the aftermath now that we can enter the wreck of this spectacle and say, here's how we can account for it more deeply. Here is how we can have a complex reading. Madonna always laid claim to being a female artist who was breaking new ground, and in her own testimony laid claim to an engagement with feminist politics. A lot of times people act as though feminists bring an unwarranted critique to Madonna, but I think Madonna received so much attention from feminists precisely because she positioned herself as a woman within the music industry who was going to break new ground and who was going to challenge the sexism of that industry. And as we know, for early on in her career, she actually did live out that particular praxis, and that's, I think, why many of us continue to have affection for her as a cultural icon, even as we feel incredibly disturbed by the fact that stardom, which by its very nature has to be reproduced again and again, meant that at a certain point, as an aging woman, Madonna had to have a new gimmick to renew interest in her. And it's not surprising that a major part of her reinvention of herself becomes a reattachment to sexism. When Madonna appeared in, I think it's Vanity Fair that she appears in, and all the little girl sort of sexual sadomasochistic kind of pictures and everything, it's suddenly a complete repudiation of the kind of images of a powerful woman that she theoretically talked about wanting to put forth. And it's a reinvestment in patriarchy, but let's face it, there's always going to be more money to be had and more stardom to be had in patriarchy. And for a while, Madonna worked the feminist revolutionary tip as far as she could push it. And then she needed a new driving force. To me, Madonna symbolizes so much the question of greed. I think exactly like many rap musicians, I don't believe that in her, quote, real life, Madonna is committed to any of the sexist images that she's quite willing to reproduce for a profit. But in fact, she's willing to turn that particular trick in order to make more and more money, even though we all know this is an incredibly wealthy human being who theoretically should not have to debase and degrade her principles to earn money. But the reproduction of stardom says, I must earn more and more and more money. And it's interesting that not only does she come back to patriarchy, but she also comes back to white supremacy. I was so amazed by the incredible racist comments she makes in Spin magazine in a recent interview about black culture and black men, when she goes on to tell us that black men are the most sexist men on the planet. I said it's kind of like Madonna out of Africa. You know, it's like, report from the front. I went into the jungle, I fucked all those black men, and I used black culture in my videos, but I'm here to testify that they really are primitive, that they really are the most sexist people on the planet. I used to kind of like black people, but I'm not sure I do anymore. And I was really fascinated by that, because I thought to myself, this person is actually using this interview to reposition herself as a voice for the right. Because let's face it, there's more money to be made on the right than there will ever be to be made on the left. But what was most sad was not her as an individual repositioning herself, but people not responding to the kinds of anti-black statements that she made with outrage and disgust. Here's a woman whose white husband was beating her up, and yet she doesn't tell us that any of these black men have engaged in domestic violence with her, and yet black men come to stand for the most sexist people on the planet. And that was very, very, very distressing, and distressing that as a contributing editor to Spin, as a black woman, I really couldn't get anybody involved with Spin magazine to be at all interested and concerned about a critique of this particular issue or the statements, because it was a big money-making issue. I mean, I just recently did a seminar at Sony Music where I sat on a panel with black male executives who said, and a female executive who said, race is not the issue. The only color that matters in this society is the color green, you know, the color of dollars. This is another American myth that people want to really believe right now, that only dollars matter. Because not only does it allow the collusion of people of color with the perpetuation of white supremacy, or, you know, women with the perpetuation of patriarchy, it also creates a culture where there is no moral or ethical valuation that you can bring to bear upon anything, because the assumption is that we all share the common morality of the dollar, which is get as much as you can, as quickly as you can, by any means necessary. If I had talked about Spike Lee filmmaking before he made Girl 6, I would really be assessing him very differently from my assessment of him after he's made Girl 6, because I find Girl 6 to be a movie that not only challenges Hollywood, I feel that it's a critical read on Hollywood. I mean, that moment in the opening of the film when you have Quentin Tarantino saying that he's going to make the best black film.
Okay. This movie is going to be big. Bigger than big. Huge. Greatest romantic African-American film ever made. Directed by me, of course.
I mean, that was such a deconstructive moment where Spike Lee was saying, this is what blackness has come to mean in Hollywood. It doesn't have anything to do with what color the person is. It's a certain image of blackness that Hollywood finally believes can be negotiated by any cultural maker.
We're looking for the range of Angela Bassett. We're looking for the total game, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Black people aren't needed to produce black cinematic culture because white people can produce that culture. And there's a lot of critiques of Hollywood and a certain value system in Girl 6 that Spike Lee himself has played along with in order to get to the position where he can use Hollywood as a vehicle to make certain critiques. And I don't want to say in order to get there to suggest some kind of continuum where, you know, the person says, I'm a radical, but I'll pretend I'm a conservative, you know, for 10 years, but at the end of it all, when I've made my wealth, I will make the radical cultural production. I think that it's precisely the opposite, that no matter how successful Spike Lee has been in Hollywood, he is still put down by mass media. He still does not have the level of opportunity that would be available to him had he been seen as a bright, young, white, up-and-coming filmmaker. So that I think that his bitterness towards that system is actually concrete and real and not a function of a kind of radicalization that pretended to be conservative and became more radical, but the kind of radicalization that comes from a person who wholeheartedly embraces the rules of a game and find that no matter how well they follow those rules, they still are not a real contestant in the game and they still cannot win. A major magazine like Time or Newsweek just recently carried a story on Spike Lee as a failure. I mean, it just was amazing. How could you talk about Spike Lee as a failure? And it was something like, you know, Malcolm X was made for $37 million, but it only made 40-some million. And I thought, well, how is that a failure? You not only paid for your movie, but you had some excess profit, though not a great deal, not what Hollywood would want. But that can become talked about in mass media as a failure, even though Woody Allen, who has made many films that do not make a lot of money, does not then get talked about as a failed filmmaker. And so that it is in the interest of a certain structure of white supremacy and patriarchy to put Spike Lee down at this point in his career and to make it seem that somehow he could not deliver the goods, because part of that is about sanctioning white people to become the new makers of so-called black film. As in, for example, a film like Waiting to Exhale, which is sold and marketed in ways that suggest this is a black film. I mean, people kept telling me, this is a film about black women, this is going to be for black people. In fact, this was a typical Hollywood, shitty, uninteresting film. The script written by white people, all marketed as being a film by and about blackness, successfully. Nothing Spike Lee has done can match the financial returns of this piece of shit. This is how blackness can be done successfully, and the problem lies not with the terms of what makes blackness successful in Hollywood or on the screen, but with Spike Lee as an individual. I mean, and that I think is tragic, because so many black people are buying into that mode of thinking, that Spike Lee somehow represents a failure, when in fact Spike Lee will continue to be the most successful black filmmaker in the United States, and he's not by any means a failure. There's a way in which, as Hollywood decides to occupy the territory of blackness, as white Hollywood decides to occupy the territory of blackness, it becomes very useful to say, we let black people have that territory, and they just didn't know what to do with it. They made these strange films like Girl 6 that didn't even have a plot. I mean, Crooklyn didn't even have a plot, which of course is completely bogus, because of course the plot of Crooklyn was very obvious and very simple. It was about a family where the mother is dying in the family. But I can't tell you how many white reviewers wrote that it didn't have a plot, when what they should have said is that it didn't have a plot that interested us, that white America is not interested in black mothers that are dying. So I think that this is going to have deep ramifications for the future of representing blackness in Hollywood, because it really is almost a public announcement of the white takeover of that particular territory, the issue of representing blackness in Hollywood.